The wind howled across the vast, empty plains of Wyoming, kicking up a relentless storm of dust that coated everything in a fine, ochre powder. For years, Elias Thorne had come to believe that this dust was all that was left of his life, a constant, suffocating reminder of his failures. At 45, his hands were calloused from years of working the land, his face a roadmap of weathered lines, and his heart a barren wasteland. His ranch, a sprawling but isolated patch of land, was his world. He had built it with the dream of a family, but that dream had long since turned to ash. Elias had been married once, to a woman named Sarah, whose laughter had once filled the silent canyons of his life. After 3 years of trying and a devastating miscarriage that had almost taken Sarah's life, they discovered the truth. Elias was infertile. The diagnosis had been a death knell for their dreams and eventually for their marriage. Sarah, heartbroken and unable to face a future without children, had left him. Elias sold off most of his cattle, fired his hands, and retreated into a solitary existence. His only companions, the mournful moaning of the wind and the ghosts of what could have been. He spent his days mending fences, tending to the few cattle he kept, and trying not to think. The local town, Harmony Creek, was a place he only visited for supplies, and even then, he was a spectre, a shadow of the man he once was. People knew his story, and their pity was a weight he couldn't bear. They'd nod, offer a sympathetic word, and then turn away, leaving him to the quiet echo of his own despair. One evening, as a particularly cold front swept in from the mountains, bringing a biting chill with it, Elias was sitting on his porch, a mug of coffee clutched in his hands. The sun was a dying ember on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange. Just as the last light faded, he saw them, 2 small figures trudging up the long, winding road that led to his ranch. He squinted, a frown creasing his brow. It was too late for visitors, and besides, no one ever came this far out. As they drew closer, he realized with a start that they were children. A girl who looked no older than 12 was half carrying a smaller girl, maybe 5 or 6, whose tiny legs were stumbling with exhaustion. Their clothes were ragged, their faces smudged with dirt and tears. Elias felt a pang of unease. He was no man for children. They were a reminder of everything he had lost, a living symbol of his unfulfilled purpose. But the look of desperation in the older girl's eyes was undeniable. He rose from his chair, his tall frame a silhouette against the fading light, and waited. "Mister," the older girl said, her voice a reedy whisper, her small body trembling. "Please, we don't have anywhere to go. My name's Amelia, and this is my sister, Rose. Our ma and pa, they're gone." Rose, the younger one, clung to Amelia's tattered dress, her wide brown eyes full of a fear that went beyond the cold. Elias looked from one to the other, a battle raging within him. His mind screamed at him to turn them away, to tell them to go to Harmony Creek, where they would find proper help. But something in his heart, a long-dormant instinct, rebelled. The silence of the plains, which had been a comfort, suddenly felt like a tomb. He couldn't leave them out there, not in this cold. "Get inside," he grumbled, his voice rough from disuse. "You can stay the night. We'll figure the rest out in the morning." He didn't wait for a response, just turned and walked into the house, leaving the door open. He heard their shuffling footsteps as they followed, and for the first time in years, the silence of his home was broken by the sound of something other than his own lonely movements. The morning brought a cruel, biting frost. The world outside was white with it, a stark contrast to the warmth of Elias's kitchen, where a fire now crackled in the hearth. He had given the girls a corner of his bunkhouse for the night and had woken before dawn to start a fire and put a pot of coffee on. Amelia and Rose emerged from the bunkhouse, looking a little cleaner but still weary. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the small wooden table. He placed 2 bowls of oatmeal in front of them, a simple, nourishing meal. The girls ate slowly, as if unsure if the food was real. Elias watched them, his gaze heavy. He noticed the bruises on Amelia's arms, the way she flinched when he moved too quickly. The story she had told him the night before was a simple one. Their parents had died in a wagon accident a few weeks back. They had been trying to make their way to relatives in Montana, but the look in her eyes suggested something darker. After breakfast, Elias sat down opposite them. "Now, where are you from exactly? And who are these relatives?" he asked, his voice firm but not unkind. Amelia hesitated, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. We were near Fort Laramie. The wagon it broke, and then some men came. They took everything." Her voice wavered and she looked down at her hands. "Our ma and pa, they fought them, and they didn't make it." A cold dread settled in Elias's stomach. The region was full of drifters and outlaws, and a defenseless family would be easy prey. He looked at Rose, who was now clutching her sister's hand, her thumb in her mouth. The small girl's face was a mirror of her sister's grief, a silent testimony to a horror he could only imagine. "And the men?" Elias pressed, his jaw tight. Amelia shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "They rode away. We waited a few days, but no one came. We started walking." Elias stood up and walked to the window, his back to them. He stared out at the barren landscape, the same land he had once seen as a promise. Now, it felt like a tomb, a place where dreams died. He was a man who had built a wall around his heart, and these two girls were chipping away at it with every whispered word, every fragile glance. He knew he couldn't just send them away, not to face a world that was so unforgiving. He also knew he wasn't equipped to deal with them. He was a solitary man, a ghost in his own life. He turned back to them, his expression one of a man who had just made an impossible decision. "You can stay," he said, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "For now. We'll figure out what to do." A wave of relief washed over Amelia's face, and she let out a small, shaky breath. "Thank you, mister. Thank you so much." Elias just nodded. The silence that followed was different now. It wasn't the empty, hollow silence of his loneliness. It was a silence filled with the silent, unspoken weight of their shared grief and the uneasy stirrings of a new, uncertain future. The first few weeks were a delicate dance of awkwardness and tentative trust. Elias was gruff and distant, unsure how to interact with the two new additions to his world. He would leave food out for them, chop wood, and go about his chores, all the while acutely aware of their presence. The girls, for their part, were quiet and observant, like two small shadows, but slowly things began to change. Elias noticed the small things. Amelia, despite her age, was incredibly resilient. She helped with chores, her small hands learning to wash dishes and sweep floors. She would sit with Rose and read to her from a tattered old book they had salvaged from their travels. Rose, the younger sister, was a timid little creature, but she had a mischievous sparkle in her eyes that would occasionally break through her shyness. One afternoon, Elias was mending a fence on the far side of the ranch when Rose, holding a handful of wildflowers she had picked, came stumbling towards him. "For you, mister," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He looked down at the vibrant flowers in her tiny hand, then at her earnest face. He hadn't seen a bouquet of flowers in years, not since Sarah had left. A lump formed in his throat. He took them from her, a reluctant smile playing on his lips. "Thank you, Rose. They're beautiful." From that day on, a fragile bridge began to form between them. Rose would follow him around, chattering about the birds she saw or the clouds in the sky. Elias found himself answering her, his voice softening. He taught her how to recognize different tracks in the mud, how to tell a storm was coming by the scent of the air. Amelia, too, began to open up. She asked him questions about the ranch, about the cattle, about the history of the land. She was a quick study, and Elias, finding a purpose in teaching, began to show her how to care for the horses and how to mend a saddle. He saw in her the kind of toughness and determination that was forged by a hard life, and he respected it. One evening, as they sat around the fire, a sudden downpour drumming on the tin roof, Amelia spoke of her parents. Her voice was no longer a whisper, but a steady, somber tone. "They were good people," she said, her eyes fixed on the flames. "They always said we were a family no matter what, that's what matters." Elias listened, his gaze thoughtful. He had spent so long defining himself by what he lacked, by the family he couldn't have. But here, in the dim light of his small home, with two small girls who had lost everything, he was a family. An unlikely one, but a family nonetheless. He felt a slow, unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest, a feeling he had thought he would never experience again. The dust and the silence of his life were being replaced, not by grand gestures, but by the small, steady rhythms of a new kind of love. The news of Elias Thorne taking in two orphaned girls spread through Harmony Creek like a wildfire. Elias, who had been a ghost in the town for years, was now the subject of whispers and gossip. Some people were genuinely moved by his act of kindness, while others were cynical, betting on how long it would be before he buckled under the pressure and sent the girls away. The girls, too, were a source of curiosity. On their first trip to town with Elias to buy supplies, they were met with a mix of curious stares and shy smiles. Amelia held Rose's hand tightly, her small body tense. Elias, sensing her unease, placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Just ignore them," he said, his voice a low rumble. "They don't know you." But one person who did seem to know them was Sheriff Ben Carter, a kind and burly man who had been a friend of Elias's father. He approached Elias as he was loading sacks of flour into his wagon. "Elias, I heard about the girls," the sheriff said, his eyes filled with concern. "That's a big responsibility, my friend. Are you sure you're up to it?" Elias looked at him, a flash of defensiveness in his eyes. "I'm not a monster, Ben. I couldn't leave them out there." "I know that, Elias," the sheriff said, holding up his hands in a placating gesture. "But there are things you need to know. We've been getting reports of a gang of outlaws operating in this area. They're ruthless. They prey on folks traveling alone. The descriptions we've been given, they match what Amelia described. They're calling themselves the Rattlesnakes. They've left a trail of terror in their wake." The sheriff's words sent a chill down Elias's spine. Amelia's story hadn't been a child's exaggeration. It was a cold, hard truth. He felt a surge of protectiveness, a fierce, primal instinct he hadn't known he possessed. The world was dangerous, and he had brought two innocent girls into his solitude. His quiet, lonely life had been safe. Now, with them, he had a reason to be afraid. He had something to lose again. On the way back to the ranch, Elias was quieter than usual. He kept his eyes on the horizon, his hand resting on the rifle he kept beside him. He wasn't just a hermit anymore. He was a guardian, and he would do whatever it took to keep his new family safe. Life at the Thorne Ranch settled into a new, comfortable routine. Amelia took on more responsibilities, her confidence growing with each passing day. Rose, no longer the timid shadow, was a ball of boundless energy, her laughter echoing across the plains. For Elias, the ranch was no longer a symbol of his failure. It was a home. One afternoon, while Elias was teaching Amelia how to mend a fence properly, a rider appeared on the horizon. He rode with purpose, kicking up a trail of dust behind him. As he drew closer, Elias's heart began to pound a slow, heavy rhythm in his chest. It was a man he knew, a man he had hoped to never see again. His name was Frank Hayes. He was a distant cousin of Elias's late wife, Sarah, and a man Elias had once considered a friend. Frank had a reputation in town for being a smooth talker and a sharp businessman, but Elias had always seen a cold, calculating glint in his eyes. Frank dismounted and walked towards them, a slick smile on his face. "Well, Elias Thorne," he said, his voice dripping with faux cordiality, "heard you've got some company. It's a good thing. A man like you needs a family." He looked at Amelia and Rose, his eyes lingering on them with an unsettling curiosity. "They're a bit young to be out here, aren't they? Don't you think they need a proper home, a place with a real family?" Elias felt a surge of anger. "They're fine, Frank. What do you want?" "Easy, cousin," Frank said, holding up his hands. "Just wanted to check on you and to tell you about an opportunity. There's a lawyer in town, a good man. He's looking for a family to take on 2 young girls. They would be well cared for, given a good education. A real chance at a future." He paused, his smile widening. "A future they can't have out here with a man like you, who knows nothing about raising children." His words were like a physical blow. Frank was preying on Elias's deepest insecurities, on the very fears he had been battling. He had a glimmer of understanding then. Frank wasn't just being a good Samaritan. He was a threat. "They are my family, Frank," Elias said, his voice low and dangerous. "They're not for sale, and they're not going anywhere." Frank's smile didn't falter, but a cold glint appeared in his eyes. "We'll see about that, Elias. We'll see." He turned and mounted his horse, riding away with a smug confidence that left a bitter taste in Elias's mouth. Amelia, who had been listening silently, looked at Elias, her eyes wide with fear. "He wants to take us away, doesn't he?" she whispered. Elias knelt down, his gaze steady. "He can try," he said, his voice firm, "but he won't succeed. I won't let him." The ghost of his past, in the form of Frank Hayes, had returned, and with him a new conflict had been introduced. The fight for his family had just begun. The encounter with Frank Hayes left Elias unsettled. He knew Frank was a cunning man, and his offer to help was nothing more than a thinly veiled threat. He had to act. Elias rode into Harmony Creek, a sense of urgency in his gut. He went straight to the sheriff's office. He explained the situation, the details of Frank's visit and his suspicions. The sheriff listened intently, his expression grim. "I've heard things about Frank," he said. "He's been dabbling in land deals, trying to buy up small ranches from people who are struggling. He's always one step ahead, and he has some unsavory connections." Elias felt a cold knot form in his stomach. "You think he's connected to those outlaws?" The sheriff shook his head. "I can't say for sure, but it wouldn't surprise me. The man is a viper. He sees an opportunity and he takes it. He probably sees the girls as a way to get to your land, Elias. If he can prove you're an unfit guardian, he could have the courts grant him guardianship and then sell off your land. He knows you're a man of your word, and he knows you'd never abandon them." The sheriff's words painted a clear and terrifying picture. Frank wasn't just a ghost from the past. He was a very real, very dangerous threat. He was manipulating the legal system, using the girls as pawns to get what he wanted, Elias's land. The solitude that had once protected Elias was now a liability. Elias left the sheriff's office feeling a heavy weight of responsibility. He was no longer just a protector, he was a strategist. He had to fight for his family, not just with his fists, but with his wits. Back at the ranch, he gathered Amelia and Rose. He sat them down and explained the situation in simple, honest terms. "Frank wants something from us, and he's going to try to take you away to get it, but we won't let him." He looked at Amelia, his gaze firm. "I need you to be strong, to not let him scare you. We have each other. That's all that matters." Amelia nodded, her small face set with a fierce determination that mirrored his own. "We're not going anywhere, Mr. Elias," she said, her voice filled with a conviction that brought a lump to his throat. "We're staying with you." Elias knew then that he wasn't alone in this fight. The web of deception that Frank Hayes was weaving was a strong one, but it was nothing compared to the bond that was now forged between the three of them. Frank Hayes wasn't one to give up easily. After his initial visit, he began to appear with increasing frequency, his visits becoming more and more menacing. He would ride by the ranch, his presence a silent threat. He would show up in town, cornering Elias and making veiled remarks about his unconventional living situation. The community of Harmony Creek was divided. Some people, like the sheriff, were wary of Frank and offered their quiet support to Elias. But others, swayed by Frank's charm and smooth talk, began to see Elias as an unstable figure, a recluse who had suddenly taken on a responsibility he was not prepared for. One afternoon, a letter arrived at the ranch. It was from a lawyer in a nearby town, a man Frank had hired. The letter was a formal notice stating that a hearing had been set to determine the legal guardianship of Amelia and Rose. The date was set for 1 week from that day. The storm that Elias had been anticipating was finally here. He showed the letter to the sheriff, his hands trembling with a mixture of rage and fear. "He's going to use this against me, isn't he?" "He's going to try," the sheriff said. "He'll argue that you're a hermit, that you're not financially stable, that you're an old, broken man. He'll paint a picture of an unstable home, and he'll present himself as the alternative, a man of means, a pillar of the community." Elias felt a wave of despair wash over him. Frank had thought of everything. He had used Elias's own past, his own pain, against him. How could he, a man who had lost everything, a man who had isolated himself from the world, prove he was a worthy guardian? But then he looked at the girls. He saw Rose, her face smeared with mud as she laughed, chasing a stray chicken. He saw Amelia diligently mending a bridle, her brow furrowed in concentration. He saw the trust in their eyes, the love that had blossomed in the barren landscape of his life. He knew what he had to do. This wasn't just a fight for his ranch. This was a fight for his family, a fight for the 2 little girls who had given him a reason to live again. He would not be the broken man Frank had painted him to be. He would be a man who had found his purpose, a man who would fight for what was his. The storm was gathering, but Elias Thorne would not be swept away by it. The days leading up to the hearing were a blur of preparation. Elias, with the help of Sheriff Carter, went about gathering evidence. They visited the town doctor, who vouched for the girls' health and well-being. They spoke to the local store owner, who attested to Elias's regular purchases of food and supplies for the girls. The real help, however, came from the most unexpected of places. The people of Harmony Creek, who had once been so quick to judge, began to rally around him. A group of local ranchers, men who had known Elias for years, came to his home to offer their support. They had heard about Frank's threats, and they were not having it. "You're a good man, Elias," one of them said. "You've always been fair. You took these girls in when no one else would. We'll stand by you." They offered to testify on his behalf, to paint a picture of a man who, despite his quiet nature, was a man of integrity and a pillar of the community. They spoke of his honesty, his hard work, and the transformation they had witnessed since the girls had arrived. The women of the town, too, stepped up. They brought over homemade clothes for the girls, baked goods, and words of encouragement. They talked about the girls' bright smiles and their polite nature, testaments to the good home they had found. Elias was overwhelmed. He had spent so long in his self-imposed isolation that he had forgotten the power of community, of people coming together for a common cause. His world, which had once been so small and solitary, was now a network of support, a web of kindness. The people who had once been spectators in his life were now his allies. On the morning of the hearing, Elias and the girls were dressed in their best clothes, the girls' faces scrubbed clean. and their hair tied back with ribbons. He looked at them, a fierce love swelling in his chest. They were his reason. They were his strength. They rode into town, not as a lonely old rancher with 2 orphans, but as a family, a unit, surrounded by the quiet support of a town that had finally seen the truth. The courtroom was a small, stuffy room, filled with the quiet murmur of a crowd. Frank Hayes, dressed in a sharp suit, sat on one side of the room, an arrogant smirk on his face. Elias sat on the other, the girls on either side of him, their small hands clutching his. The lawyer Frank had hired, a slick, fast-talking man, began his case. He painted a picture of Elias as a reclusive, financially unstable man, unfit to raise children. He spoke of the girls' potential lack of education, their exposure to a harsh, isolated life. He argued that the girls needed a home with a proper family, a family with means and a proper standing in the community. Elias listened, his jaw tight. Frank's words were a carefully constructed web of half-truths and lies, and he felt a rising sense of dread. But then it was his turn. The sheriff took the stand first. He spoke of Elias's long-standing character, his reputation as a fair and honest man. He spoke of his own observations, of the girl's happy, healthy appearance. He vouched for Elias's home, a clean and safe place, filled with a love that could not be bought. Then the townspeople took the stand. The store owner, the ranchers, the women who had come to the ranch. They all spoke of the change they had seen in Elias, the way he had come out of his shell, the love he showed the girls. They painted a picture of a man who, despite his past, had found a new purpose, a new reason to live. Finally, Amelia was asked to speak. She walked to the stand, her head held high, her small face filled with a quiet dignity that belied her age. "My name is Amelia," she said, her voice clear and steady. "And this is my sister, Rose. Our parents died. We were alone. Mr. Elias, he saved us. He gave us a home. He teaches us. He cares for us. We are happy here. This is our family. Please don't take us away from him." Her words, so simple and so honest, had a profound effect on the courtroom. The judge, a stoic old man, looked from Frank to Elias, a thoughtful expression on his face. He looked at the girls, at the bond they shared with the quiet man who had taken them in. "Frank Hayes," the judge said, his voice ringing through the silent room, "you have presented a case based on speculation and innuendo. The community, on the other hand, has presented a case based on fact, on observation, and on the clear evidence of love. The girls are thriving. Their well-being is not in question. I rule that Elias Thorne is a fit and proper guardian for Amelia and Rose." A wave of relief washed over Elias. He felt a tear roll down his cheek. He had won. He had won his family back. He stood up, and the people of Harmony Creek clapped, their cheers a thunderous echo in the small room. Frank Hayes sat, his face a mask of shock and anger, his carefully constructed plan in ruins. The ride back to the ranch was filled with a triumphant silence. Rose was asleep in the wagon, her head on Amelia's lap. Amelia, for the first time since she had arrived, was completely relaxed, a soft smile on her face. Elias felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. The weight of his grief, the burden of his solitude, had been lifted. The dust of his past had been settled by the rain of his present. Back at the ranch, they sat on the porch, watching the sun set, painting the sky in a fiery display of color. The silence was still there, but it was no longer an empty void. It was a comfortable, companionable silence, filled with the warmth of a family that had been forged in the crucible of hardship. Elias knew that their journey was not over. There would be challenges, and there would be new horizons to face. He would have to continue to fight for his family, to provide for them, to protect them, but he was no longer alone. He had the love of two little girls who had filled the barren landscape of his heart with life and color. He had a purpose, a reason to be, a reason to wake up every morning and face the new day. He reached out and took Amelia's hand. She squeezed it, a silent promise of a future filled with hope. He looked at the vast open plains, a land that had once been a symbol of his loneliness. Now it was a blank canvas, a new beginning, waiting to be painted with the colors of a family. The infertile rancher had given up on family for years, but in the end, family had found him in the form of two orphaned girls who had taught him how to love, how to hope, and how to live again.